We start with two eminent, prestigious neuroscientists, some of the most cited authors in the world, and we are very proud to have a dialogue on fundamental themes of on our brain information processing. And we think this is a very happy beginning of our dialogue session. And the virtual floor is now for Professor György Buzsáki with more empirical aspects, and then Professor Karl Friston will follow with more general theoretical visions. Then we will, as you will have seen in the program, we will have their mutual dialogue, and then we will have half an hour. Okay, Professor Buzsáki, your virtual
Thank you so much.
Your virtual floor is for you.
Yes, thank you so much. This is an extraordinary privilege to talk with Karl and discuss certain points where we overlap and maybe some areas that there may be some divergence. For those of you who were not in this room 5 minutes ago, I have a disaster with my computer, actually two of my computers. Therefore, I cannot show you slides. Nevertheless, I thought I can give you my introduction that probably would make it clear where the connections between Karl's world and my world exist. So the problem that we are discussing today is about the brain and its relationship to the world. The problem didn't start, of course, with the brain. It started with the spirit, and then the soul, and the mind, and only recently with the brain. So we were not interested. Our ancestors wondered why we exist in the world and why the world is the way it is, and made up various scenarios. And through Christian philosophies and probably other philosophies and religions, the idea is that our mind, our soul was given to us by some higher authority in order to obey the commands and learn about the beautiful world that they created for us. So this gave to a framework or thinking that the mind is there to absorb the beauty of the world. It's a passive mechanism. The only thing we'd have to know is perceive and learn the veridical information about the world, and then evaluate it, choose between good and bad. If you choose good, you will go to heaven, and if you don't do that right, then you go to somewhere else. So that was the framework, but the problem was that in order to behave well, you have to have a decision of the inputs that come to your brain, and that became a 1,000 or several thousand-year-old problem. This is the area somewhere between the input and the output, or the perception and the action of the brain. This is the gray area that our predecessors called free will, homunculus, consciousness, representation, intervening variable. In modern terms, you can call it a black box or information processing or something like that. Then, of course, that framework has, from folk psychology, affected philosophers, and then philosophers affected psychologists. Psychologists were still interested in the mind, but they were trying to get it closer and closer to the substrate that generates the mind. And then when neuroscience emerged, this was the framework that was given to us. It came with a vocabulary, you can call it baggage, that was the goal for neuroscience. It was a laid out problem. The problems already were conceived. The words and the terms were already given to us, and all we had to do is to find homes for many things, such as visual processing, auditory processing, and higher words such as desire, creativity, goals, the working memory, decisions, and all those things. And I have a beautiful cartoon which I can't show you, that as a result there were so many words concocted by our predecessors that it doesn't really fit into the brain. So I made the frontal cortex is a very large. I call the frontal cortex is the trash bag of neuroscientists, because if they don't understand something, they put it in that box, and that is one type of framework, namely to find, well, all these things are represented, if you want, or representing something, and then there is always this middle problem, which is the decision has to be made some way, one way or another. So I advocate an alternative framework, namely that the brain's most important job is to maintain its own dynamic. The second important job is to generate an output. Once you generate an output, the survival probability is higher. Only then it is worthwhile to add sensors to the brain, because now you can make the action more effective. So this is the fundamental goal, if you want, or fundamental organization of small and large systems. It doesn't matter how big the brain is. The most important thing is to detect and remember the consequences of previous actions, so we can use them for future better actions. Now, this, of course, requires a certain type of brain organization. The original picture that you can have in front of you is Descartes' picture. There is a rose outside or an arrow outside, and this is projected to somewhere into your brain. Decision is made, and then it goes to the output. Now, the truth is that this is not really the brain anatomy, and certainly not the brain physiology. Instead, the way the brain is organized, that every single output system, whether it goes to the muscles or it goes to the endocrine system, or whether it goes to your autonomic system, has a return envelope to the sensory system and higher organizational systems in the cortex as a feedback. It's called corollary discharge. So now we have two interesting problems. One is that in the Descartesian idea, first of all, we don't see an arrow, we don't see a rose, and the neurons in the visual cortex have no clue what they are seeing. All they see is action potentials coming from other neurons. So how the meaning of the picture that comes to the retina is made is a big issue. And you can ask the question, what else is available for the brain besides perception? And the answer is that the only second thing that is available is action. And every single time when you perceive something, you would like to get a second opinion, a verification of the consequences of your actions, or to verify what is the meaning of the input that comes to your sensors. So this is where I think we have a strong overlap with Karl, that indeed there are two issues and two available things that are available for the brain to learn about the world through the brain's own experiences, as well as through evolutionary imprinting, if you want. So going back to the fundamental goals of the brain, said the most important thing is to predict the consequences of the action. And you can imagine a small brain that does it very effectively in its own niche, such as the brain of a bee. Now, from this very small brain, the evolution adds a loop and another loop and another loop and another loop, and all these loops are getting more and more complicated. But they still have the same thing, which is to predict the consequences of the brain's actions, but now in a much more complex environment and at a much longer time scale. So this brain is very good because it can do a lot more qualitatively or quantitatively than a small brain. But it's not yet cognition. cognition comes at the next stage. So these loops become very, very smart. And the result of their smartness, it becomes a possibility that now you can disconnect the brain. The brain can disengage from the environment and the body, and it can still do actions through this corollary discharge system, because it can verify the previously acquired knowledge, and it can ask what if scenario questions. What if I figured out how to fix Google Chrome? Then you would be seeing my slides here. And my other evaluation was that let's just forget about the slides and I do this. So these are the scenarios that I can do without any output, without any action, because my brain has already been calibrated. The summary of this part saying is that the only source of knowledge for the brain is action. That's the only, not the knowledge, but the only way to verify what knowledge means and meaning means is through action. Now, I wanted to give you an example about this, and the example would be the connection between spatial navigation, memory, and prediction. This is the area that I invested some time, and for many years, it has been known that there are two ways to navigate. One is what is called dead reckoning type of navigation. You are looking at and measuring the direction as well as the number of steps you take or the number of nautical miles you sail. This is exactly how Christopher Columbus came to discover America, and then at the end you can go back taking the shortest cut. Now this is one way. The other one is that you make or get a map from somebody and use that as a guidance. Now, in order to make a map, you have to visit every single part of the world, and then once the map is made, that it's there forever. With the help of a map, you can go from anywhere to anywhere else without actually taking the path before. So the Nobel Prizes were given for this navigation system in the hippocampus, but it didn't explain how the same exact structures, the hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, and its colleagues, are capable also to generate episodic memories or memories. Psychologists and brain researchers, and especially human researchers, were investigating almost independently for decades what the hippocampus is about, and it was all about memory, memory, memory. And there used to be a lip service between the navigation field that said, oh, all you have to do is to give time to the play cells, and then you will get episodic memory. But that arrow or that link didn't work. But you can think about this differently. Namely, that the algorithms that are being used for spatial navigation and mental navigation, that is traveling back to the past or traveling forward to the future, are exactly the same, and the same structures are used. And this is the revelation over the past 20 years, indeed from several sources, especially from Eleanor McGuire's group, that the same systems, hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, entorhinal cortex, are being used for imagination, planning, and memory, as well as navigation. Now, the difference between the two, that navigation is possible in any animal because the agent can interact with the environment. Now, by disengaging from the world, the same kind of navigation can be made with the same hardware, the same software, but now you are not relying on the world, and this is the emergence of cognition. I think I used pretty much up my time. I wanted to tell you about a couple of other things, namely that the idea that the brain is an egalitarian system, which is used by several prominent people. I just wanted to mention two names here, would be Alan Turing and John Hopfield, is not really correct. The brain is very strongly skewed. In other words, the connectivity of the brain shows a log normal distribution. The firing rates of individual neurons show a log normal distribution. Everything is in a log scale for probably a good reason, is because the the goal of the computation is always a comparison. It's always a ratio. The brain functions in ratios rather than pluses and minuses. And this, of course, this skewed organization, the log normality of the hardware, the anatomy, and the log normality of the dynamics, perhaps can explain the one and only law that neuroscience has, which is the Weber-Fechner law. I had a bunch of slides showing that, and it illustrated that, but it's enough to say that this non-egalitarian system has to be created one way or another. And my next pieces of slides would show that this is indeed happens during ontogeny. Neurons that are born together, they wire together and fire together. So this inside-out network, or inside-out thinking, puts the previous kind of thinking on its head, namely that it's not that neurons fire together, therefore wire together. It may be the other way around. The overall consequence of this is that learning, per se, is not a de novo synthesis and starting out from nothing, and then you have to adjust every single time the synaptic weights, but it's more like a Lego game that is every single time you plan to make an action, a sequence of actions, then a sequence is already there, pre-configured, and all you have to do is select what is available. So learning is more like a matching process between pre-configured patterns and experience, and meaning can be acquired by adding utility to some of the pre-existing patterns by experience. So you can imagine that the brain is a spaghetti, and they are available, these sequences are available for attaching some meaning, and it is the action of the brain or action of the organism that allows that some actions become meaningful and others are not. Now, the way I talked is so orthogonal what Karl is going to talk about, but you will see that, in fact, it's probably two different approaches trying to understand the same problem, and hopefully we will converge.
Pedro, your microphone is...
I'm sorry. I was thanking György for his great presentation, a virtual applause, and asking please Karl to Professor Friston to start his own presentation, his responses. And sorry that I was talking and my microphone was off. Okay, the virtual floor is yours, Karl, Professor Friston.
Well, thank you very much. As György says, it's an extraordinary pleasure, especially as this inaugural dialogue. And György, it's great to see you again. The last time I saw you, your face was somewhere in Cuba. A long time ago, but a delightful trip. Yeah, György has, I think, identified all the key points that I would have wanted to make, and made them very, very eloquently. So I think my job is to go through picking out some of the fundaments of this view of the brain, this view of sentient behavior, view of intelligent behavior, through the lens of a physicist or somebody who tries to understand the physics of sentience, and effectively arriving at exactly the same conclusion. So I'm going to rehearse all of the key points that I heard, and I was sort of taking little notes, is capturing key phrases and key ideas. I'm going to run through them and just try to unpack them from the point of view of a mathematical description of what it is to be alive and actively engaged with our niche, our sensorium. So György started with the notion of learning the beauty of the world, and although I think he was trying to say that there has been a more pragmatic turn in recent centuries or indeed decades, I think one can appeal to that notion of us, or at least our brains, learning the beauty of the world if one reads beauty as symmetry. And in mathematics, symmetries are invariances. So in one sense, the representations that György was talking about inherit from a particular kind of mathematical beauty, which is symmetry, I repeat, read as invariances, so that we are learning those things in our world that are conserved. Technically, if they are conserved, that basically means that we are revisiting various states of the world time and time again, and it is those states that are characteristic of the phenotype and the kind of things that we are. He then went on to sort of compare and contrast the notion of representation in the sort of outside-in sense versus something which is very close to my heart, which is a description of biotic self-organization and one could argue intelligence more generally as maintaining its own dynamic. And I think you've got exactly the same mathematical construct in play here. By maintaining the same dynamic, you're implying that the dynamics of any person or creature returns and keeps revisiting the same point, technically has an attracting set to which the dynamics are maintained. So again, we have this notion of things that are invariant over time being expressed in terms of this this maintained dynamic. That, from the point of view of physics, is the problem of self-organization. How do you self-organize to this attracting set that defines the invariances or the symmetries or the beauty that is you in your lived world? And the way that this is done, György went on to say, was basically representing or effectively emphasizing the generation of outputs. And I think that this is a fundamental, I think this is probably more apparent in terms of certainly cognitive neuroscience over the past few decades. There has been a profound turn away from 20th century perception, treatments of perception as an outside-in process, and I'm referring here to Descartes' arrow, where you're extracting information from the sensory input. That, I think, has been literally turned on its head into this inside-out view that places action center stage in terms of determining what you're going to sample and predicting the consequences of the active sampling. So I'm referring here to sort of the, again, pragmatic turn at the beginning of the century towards inactivism, manifest in many, many different ways, but really emphasizing the fact that brains are not just perception machines, they're not just sense-making machines, they are quintessentially in the game of self-organizing through coupling back and acting upon the environment to solicit the right kind of sensory input to make sense of that brain's or that person's or that creature's behavior. Illustrated with a bit of neuroanatomy. If this is the case, there are loops within loops reflecting this reciprocal or recurrent or circular causality. At the highest level, you've got this circular causality in terms of action and perception, that the universe or the world generates sensations, and those sensations cause some internal information processing, because I suspect we'll be talking about that later on. But crucially, that information processing generates an action upon the world that changes the states of the world, that generates a new sample. So you've got a continuous circular causality that cannot be broken. And indeed, you can articulate that circular causality, that perception is just in the, or sense making is just in the service of deciding what to do next and how to sample the next bit of sensory information about which you are going to make sense. But these loops also are on the inside of the brain, and certainly Professor Buzsáki's work has celebrated that, and some of his arguments speak to this importance. If there are loops inside the brain, then again you'd expect to see both a sort of bottom-up and top-down reciprocation of all the internal action, which you could say readers' attention or selection of some sort. The particular example that was brought to the table in the introductory talk was the notion of corollary discharge. And in the world of predictive coding and predictive processing, these corollary discharges are essentially predictions, exactly as articulated by György, of the consequences of my action. So I have a belief about the way the world is unfolding, and that entails a certain action upon the world. That action will have consequences. It'll have direct consequences in the proprioceptive domain, but it will also have consequences in all other modalities, including exteroceptive, visual modalities, and possibly interoceptive modalities. I have to predict all the consequences of action, and thereby I can now interpret efference copy or corollary discharge as basically the predictions that complement the ascending information, sometimes read as prediction errors in predictive coding formulations, that convey the quality of my predictions, rendering sense making and perception, active sensing, very much inside out constructive kind of behavior. And paraphrasing your meaning comes from action, and that's certainly in my sphere so true. In fact, in many spheres, whether one looks at sort of robotics or psychophysics in terms of active sensing and active vision, right through to philosophy and phenomenology, to see is to look. You can't see anything unless you're actively looking, using your motor apparatus in order to sample and navigate the world, whether it's visual palpation or, as we went on to hear, literally moving your body around a world in the context of navigation and exploration. An important, well, let me just cover the hippocampus, then return to that. So one sort of key piece of empirical evidence that I thought was beautifully demonstrated in service of this argument is the hippocampus. On the one hand, you've got this sort of scene or map construction aspect, and yet there's a whole other community talking about episodic memories. But when you think about how you build a map, you have to explore. How do you explore? You have to move around. If you have to move around, you have to remember what you saw. So it cannot be any other way that the same machinery, in György's words, the algorithm, is deployed. It's a single algorithm doing a single thing, an active scene building, model building, map building that requires a conservation of those things that are conserved, in this instance, the territory or the scene currently being explored, again in a very active way. So you went on to sort of emphasize, well, if that algorithm is at hand, how does it account for our remarkable capacity to disconnect, in his words, from the sensorium and explore counterfactual futures in which I can move around simply because I now have a memory, or I have learned the consequences of my action. And I think, again, this is incredibly important from a purely theoretical and mathematical or algorithmic perspective, because you're drawing a bright line between organisms, small organisms, say insects and the like, that do not have the kind of generative model or functional brain architectures that can have, that are disconnect in a way that they can roll out into the future. And of course, the consequences of action in the future have not yet been realized. So as soon as you free yourself from the present, from the moment, you have now the capacity to use your predictions in a counterfactual way about the consequences of what if. And that "what if" was an explicit phrase that I've noted here that that György was using. In terms of artificial intelligence research, this is basically a statement of planning as inference. Planning in the sense that I can generate counterfactual trajectories into the future if and only if I have a generative model of the consequences of my action. The ability to do that, it probably moves us beyond insects and to the level of higher order creatures, and certainly mammals, and certainly ourselves, where now we're gifted with an interesting choice, in the sense that if we are in a position to evaluate the consequences of certain plans or policies or actions, we now are obliged to select from those consequences in accord with what we would, in my world, consider the least surprising or the least costly or the most epistemically valuable action. And I sort of emphasize that because you are now putting a lot of emphasis on something that György himself was foregrounding, which is the notion of selection. It is unlikely that a virus, for example, selects from a set of policies and commits to doing that. Viruses are much simpler. They don't have this nested hierarchy of loops within loops within loops, and they are connected in an obligatory way to respond reflexively, in a merely reflexive way, very much like a thermostat to what's going on. But we, on the other hand, have the capacity to select. And if we have to select, selection is another kind of action. And it interestingly speaks to the notion of free will in the context of that kind of selection. And then finally, we heard about some of these the characteristics of neurophysiology and neuroanatomy, and the instantiation of this kind of self-organization that conforms to some of these principles. And in particular, the brain, that many characterizations of the connectome, of the physiology, of dynamics, have this log normal or sparse aspect, which some people might also associate with scale-free dynamics, and instanced in the context of psychophysics in terms of Weber's law. In my world, that again is absolutely central for a number of reasons. I've just mentioned one, I'll come back to it in closing, but the first important aspect is if we have a logarithmic, a relative, a ratio way of sense making in this active sense, then we're talking about representations, and representations equipped with uncertainty. So effectively, we're talking about a probabilistic kind of representation of the consequences, the perceptual consequences of our action. A log of a probability is a potential or an energy, which means that you should be able to find a description of this self-organization and neural dynamics in terms of some Lagrangian, in my theorizing, it would be a free energy functional that is just a log probability or a function predicated on a log probability. So this notion of logarithmic, if you like, calculus or space defined in terms of logarithms is absolutely central to probabilistic and certainly Bayesian formulations of the way that the planning as inference actually proceeds and is instantiated biophysically. But there's another, I think, really important aspect of this, which is looking at these heavy-tailed log normal distributions that have this sort of sparse aspect to them in terms of a scale-free aspect. And that normally comes accompanied with, in mathematics, which would be the renormalization group. And I think this is important because that scale invariance, if it's a network, scale invariance would normally be referred to as scale-free. But more generally, scale invariant aspect brings us full circle when György was talking about the temporal dilation or the successive separation of timescales as you ascend loop within loop within loop, so that the higher level loops that may well be very much divorced from the reflexive dynamics and self-organization at a purely sensory motor level acquire now a temporal depth, acquire now a slower kind of dynamics that could actually be evinced in terms of, say, theta activity in prefrontal, not that I dare mention prefrontal cortex anymore, but prefrontal hippocampal interactions. And that's certainly, in my world, a really important architectural feature of the generative models that we presume people use to predict their consequences of action. So that hierarchical structure is just a mathematical description of this loop within loops within loops, where crucially, the deeper you get into the hierarchy, the slower things change in terms of building a model of the consequences of your action, and that can predict those consequences at much faster timescales. And that's practically really important in terms of building intelligent artifacts that have the notion of long-term goals that contextualize short-term goals, allostasis that contextualizes and indeed takes the pressure off homeostasis, and many, many other examples. But I just want to finish with this importance of selection that we ended up with. I think that's very important because the notion of selection, not only does it speak to willed selection or the choices that we have, but it lends itself very nicely to a formalism in terms of Bayesian model selection. So if you take that potential, that energy Lagrangian that describes neuronal dynamics to represent probabilistic beliefs from which you are selecting, then you can use the mathematics of Bayesian model selection now to model this when reproducing or simulating or recreating intelligent decision making. And the whole point of this is to do action selection. So once you've selected your path into the future, you have effectively selected what you are going to do next. So action selection just becomes Bayesian model selection that is gifted when and only when you have a repertoire of alternative choices about how to respond in this situation from which you can select. And that is my response to György. Thank you.
Sorry. Many thanks, Karl, for a beautiful talk and for the punctuality. So I think the initial plan was that you can have a couple of rounds. You can respond him, György, and maybe I mean, you can switch freely between, but now at least you have some response privilege. György.
So maybe I can say that perhaps many of you are disappointed that we didn't start a fight. And we may, but I think we agree on many of the important points. Now, many of you are physicists, some of you may be neuroscientists, and you say, okay, which is the right approach? Obviously, I say the right approach is cars. I wish I learned more. I think it was Heisenberg who said that I wish I learned more math. And that applies to me too. However, let me tell the difference between the two approaches. Karl is discovering extraordinarily important principles. And his approach reminds me of the Maxwell equations. You know, it's often reminded us also or say that these are equivalent alternative formulations. So even though the equations are the same, but they apply to various different things that you'd never expect. So this is the what I can call the surprise, you know, that Karl comes in and say, oh, by the way, the free energy is capable of explaining many, perhaps all of the phenomena that are here. And this is something we have to celebrate. However, principles are substrate free. Therefore, they don't explain mechanisms. Mechanisms are always substrate dependent. So just because I learned that the brain is a dynamic system with skewed distributions and it has a hierarchical organization of cross-frequency phase coupling and things like that, that are words from physics, it doesn't help me directly to understand about the mechanism. We still have to do our homework. So I think the way I view Karl's approach and our approach is not a tension, but the healthy tension between theory that is tries to make global frameworks, which we needed very much because the old framework was just dead. You know, it can generate more and more and more results, but not organized principles. But it doesn't make the experiment useless. And so we may work together, and I just try to tell you one experiment that we have done based on Karl's suggestion or intuition is indeed that the first thing that systems have to, or brains have to maintain is its own dynamic. But that's costly. How much does it cost? So we try to estimate that cost. The way we did it is we looked at spikes that are not used for information processing. And we can come back to this term because I hate it. But learning from Shannon, we know that the information is not in the spike or in the bit, but in the interval. So if the interval is very long, which is beyond the communication regime of the brain, those are not used for anything. So we looked at many neurons in 8 different structures, how many spikes happen sporadically without any coordination with other spikes. And the short answer is larger than 50% of all spikes in the brain all the time are wasted for communication, or they cannot be used for communication. They are wasted for something else, which is driving interneurons and so on, and sustaining the dynamic of the brain. And of course, this is what resonates very much with the free energy principle, the self-organization, and all that other things. I thought I should start with this one, and then we can go to other details.
Karl, please.
Thank you. Yeah, no, excellent point. And again, there may be disappointment because there's no disagreement here, but it does provide a nice opportunity just to clarify, I think, the difference between the free energy principle and the mechanistic theories that would result from an application of the free energy principle. So I read a principle as a physicist. It's just a method, which effectively means it is a tool that can be applied. In applying that tool, you have to specify the generative model, probabilistic model to which you are applying. And that's where all the heavy lifting comes in. That's where all the empirical work comes in. That's where all the normal scientific process starts. That's where the difficult bit starts. So, one way of intuiting that is the theory of natural selection is a wonderfully encompassing, unfalsifiable story. And yet it doesn't tell you anything about why you've got two eyes, or you can speak French or Hungarian. So all the hard work, I think, is exactly in our day jobs. So from the point of view of the theorist, much of one important application of these principles is basically building artifacts in silico to try and reproduce the mechanisms that you think are being enacted in neuroscience by the brain. And then, I repeat, you do really enter the world of theories. So there could be lots of theories to which you could apply the free energy principle. At the moment, predictive coding is very popular, but it is just a theory because it's predicated on a particular kind of generative model with continuous state spaces, which would not fit comfortably with other theorists, say those doing natural language programming, who would prefer a much more discrete state space generative model. And not only are the biological mechanisms distinct, but also the functional form of the algorithms that those neural dynamics, we suppose, are realizing those algorithms also look very different. So at that point, you've got to just, basically revert to one's day job and do the empirical neuroscience in the usual way, soliciting evidence for this experimental subject or this in vitro neural network is behaving as if it had this kind of generative model or that kind of generative model, and these biophysical aspects are standing in or representing the sufficient statistics of certain belief structures, subpersonal probabilistic belief structures that, if you like, inherit from the free energy principle, but the free energy principle itself, these principles in and of themselves, don't prescribe the generative model. I should also say there was I liked your analogy with Maxwell's equations. It's probably much closer than you think. So the free energy principle is actually a variational principle of least action, and Maxwell's equations are predicated on the solutions to equations of least action. So it really is, the free energy principle really is just as useful and as useless as Maxwell's equation of motion, or indeed Newtonian laws. It is only in their application that things become, I think, become interesting. In relation to the observations about what are the possible spaces of neural dynamics and what mechanisms could they engage with, just by asking the kinds of questions you were illustrating with the intervals between spike timing. Just as a more general point, I think that also foregrounds the importance of the scale at which you are trying to get a mechanistic explanation. And I do see a big divide in neuroscience between people who focus on single neurons, and indeed in computational neuroscience and artificial intelligence research, spiking neural networks is quite a big thing in the neuromorphic computing community. And that contrasts very much with the things like predictive coding and belief propagation, in machine learning as metaphors for the brain, which works at the level of population activity, ensemble dynamics, which means you've stepped up a scale. So, and one scale does not invalidate the other. And there is actually, to my mind, a very beautiful symmetry, that the behavior of a single spiking neuron if you now work out the limiting behavior, if you had an infinite number of neurons in the population with idealized Gaussian noise, then you get back to this high level, technically a sort of Bayesian filtering account. So I'm just making the point that, people can work at different scales, and sometimes the pressure is, or the interesting questions are really, how would you link the mechanisms at one scale to the mechanisms at the, at the scale above?
So, Karl, now let me ask something that has been asked millions of times from you, and my people in the lab wanted to ask this. The subtitle of your famous paper is A Unifying Brain Theory, but some of the harsh critics in my lab would say it's not a brain theory, it is an organism theory, because homeostasis, allostasis, prediction and so on applies to the whole organism, which brings to the second question is that, if it have a global theory, how can we use it for solving minuscule problems, such as, we have the E equal MC square, but how does that help us to build a TV or a computer? How does the free energy principle helps us to understand memory, episodic memory, and many of these things? So I'm sure you have an answer that if you have a big theory, if you have a big model, is it the end? Or you have to break it down into smaller pieces and give more manageable mini theories for others?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. So I repeat, the free energy principle should not have been called a theory. I now regret putting that in the title. A theory has a very different role and utility. The free energy principle is just what it is. It is a method. It is a tool that you have to apply to a particular generative model. And as you note, that application means that you've got to identify the right kind of generative model, at which point you have theories about different generative models, different architectures, different dynamics, different implementations at different scales. And that's where all the hard work starts, which can be minuscule. It can be coarse-grained of the kind you might find in sort of functional magnetic resonance imaging and sort of, large-scale intrinsic brain networks. So the utility of the principle is exactly as using your examples, equals MC squared. It's completely useless unless you apply it to something. What do you apply it to? A theory about your favorite organism, which for us is going to be the brain. But you're also right in the free energy principle, as it's currently read, is not a description of just brains. It's a description of anything. And then the interesting question comes: what are the distinctions between different kinds of things, say sessile things, inert things, particles, small particles, big particles, and those and the kind of things that represent phenotypes like ourselves? And that's a really interesting question, which actually comes back to one of the things you concluded with, that if you ask what kind of generic things would have the ability or look as if they were divorced from the sensorium in virtue of having a hierarchical depth, so there was no connection between the interface with the world and the deep processing on the inside, and in particular the action. And what tends to happen, or what mathematically tends to happen, or does happen, is that when you get this kind of sparsity, so I'm appealing to the sparsity argument, but also the disengagement argument you were talking about, I think it's a really important and quite fundamental from the point of view of the physics of self-organization, of open systems, where you now, if you can read the internal states as effectively performing some kind of inference about the causes of the external states, and you no longer have direct access to your own action, so not the sensory consequences of action, but your actual action itself. Now you've got this dual representation or dual realization of action. You've got what you physically do But you don't know that. All you can see are the consequences. So now your action becomes a cause. It becomes a cause of your sensations. So now you have a belief about your own actions that is not your own action. And I think it is that that gives us a capacity, or perhaps it is that that allows us to be described as being able to have this ability to plan and to disengage, in your words, from the sensorium. But notice that came out of applying the free energy principle and applying it in the context of the hypothesis that was exactly the sparsity you were talking about before. So that inherits from this sort of disengagement hypothesis.
Okay, many thanks to you both. Also, thanks for the punctuality. We are maintaining a Swiss standard. Now it is time for the colleagues. I think that we all want to ask, I mean, Marcin, Professor Gornis, are you willing to ask too? Eric? Okay. Okay, I am willing to ask too. So the idea is that we frame our questions in 2-3 minutes, obtain the responses, and then we have a fluent colloquium. Okay, Marcin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for very interesting presentations. And I would have, if there was time, many questions, but I'll ask one question. It is about something which I could hear from both of you. And this was Professor Buzsáki was talking about starting point that if we want to talk about cognition, everything starts from action. We have action, then we have neuronal dynamics, and then cognition appears through disengagement from environment. I have a problem that in both presentations we could see that there was consideration of phenotypes, evolutionary aspects, but I couldn't see influence of what could be called culture. Yeah, when we consider individual phenotype development, we have that very small children, they don't consider something like causality, something that someone can do something. So here is first thing is early development lacks of this primary importance of action. Second thing is in general that when we look at how we develop our cognitive skills, culture, it doesn't have to be human culture. Culture is related to some form of communication. Let's call it language. But language requires some kind of cognitive skills. So how we can put together, we could see very low level, like physical level, where free energy is basically about thermodynamical processes. Then we have neuronal level, which is a little bit higher, but still low. And then we are immersed in cultural environment. And I couldn't see anything about this. And I think that right now there's lots of research about influence, for instance, on our cognitive development before we are born, for instance. So it is speculation probably, although in published papers it is said that even parents speaking in the time of pregnancy is influencing development. But let's say that this is not confirmed, but it is very clear that our perception of reality is from the very early time after we are born is influenced by our cultural environment. And once again, it doesn't have to be human language, but for instance, Andy Adamatsky is talking about language between trees or between plants, between fungi, and so on. So here I see this problem.
Martin,
Okay.
please, could you more or less conclude a little bit? Your
Could I
question?
what?
Whether you can conclude, please, your question, because it is
Yeah,
getting a
okay.
little bit beyond.
Okay. So
You have lost
what
time.
is the place of culture, and especially do you consider possibility that we have to consider emergence in the sense like when we talk about symmetry? Anderson was saying that breaking symmetry is what is the important aspect of reality.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any of you, please? György, Karl?
Okay, if I have to go first. So you mentioned the problem between action and language. So I can give you an example. People who live in the Andes and people who live in the Amazons, they live in a very different niche. People who live in the Andes, they see peaks of mountains and so on, and they use allocentric navigation or landmark navigation in their world. Their action repertoire is this. Now, people who live in the Amazon, all they see is a tree and the tree and the tree, the tree. That allocentric navigation is not very effective. They use a different one, which is egocentric path integration. And the consequence is their language is so damn different, very different. So this is one example. I don't speak either of those languages. I've just learned about them. They are very different. Hungarian is an action language. We have many, many more verbs for various things such as walk than many other languages. So indeed, the action does have a consequence. So that's my short answer. Another one, you said a pregnancy, development, blah, blah, blah. Yes, of course. What is the evidence? There are many, many clinical examples what happens when pregnancy goes wrong. One example that we have looked at is what happens to those neurons that are born on the same day in utero. And the astonishing finding is that neurons that are born together in the same region or different regions, but they are connected better, just like the mafia, and they stick together for the rest of the life of the animal, and they are firing together, they are synchronized better, and they represent, if you want to use this word, the places out there more similarly than those neurons that were born in a different day. So representation for me is not that the hippocampus, for example, learns what the world is like. No, there is a brain dynamic and a pattern that the brain generates, and we are trying to make use that hardware, software, algorithm, whatever the right name is, to learn something about the world. So your questions are very deep, but there are examples in experimental neuroscience that will give you some questions, some answers.
Karl, or maybe, is there any other question? Eric, please, go ahead.
Yes, I was actually interested in a couple of things. One thing is this expected free energy that Friston talks about, and policies, because I think that may link my work on communication theory and cooperation theory with higher level strategies, because policies in some sense are closer to strategies, although it may not be the way you describe it mathematically. And then I'm interested in this relationship between epistemic action and pragmatic action. I like the way you combine the two in planning. It's an interesting approach. I mean, we all work in terms of our own theories, as I sent you this email, but I think there's some interesting similarities there that could be exploited that you may not right now be able to explain, that your formal system may not be able to explain, namely very complex, coordinated cooperation between multiple agents. And there, this notion of epistemic action preceding pragmatic action. I've read part of your book, by the way, so I've never actually heard of you before, so sorry about that, but before this. But I did have to dive into this in the last week or two, and I find it quite fascinating, actually, because of the linking up with some of the work I did on communication theory, multi-agent systems, and distributed artificial intelligence. And so there, I think there may be a possibility of developing social agents in a more realistic way. Not that your high level, as you say, the instantiation will be quite complicated to figure out, but I think by the addition of a more complex view of strategic action, it may make the ability to actually create these cooperative agents more realistic. Now, I don't have enough to say about, sorry, Gregory, I don't know enough about your work, but the only thing I think I would like to comment, I think what you meant by loops is different than what Friston meant by loops, because your loops are a different kind of organizational structure than the kind of loops that occur in mathematical formalism and in programs. I think there may be something different going on in the brain than what Karl has suggested. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Maybe Karl, can you respond, please? Thanks for the.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Yes. So thank you for mentioning expected free energy. I'm glad somebody did. I didn't actually mention that. It is absolutely central mathematical construct when it comes to these sort of counterfactual futures and scoring a particular policy. And so there are so many things issues that you bring to the table. I'm going to get this back, but I'll try and be brief. The application of active inference, and specifically active inference in agents that do select their policies from using expected free energy, that very simply can be regarded as a single energy function that has both exploratory and exploitative aspects to it. You can also derive it from an admixture of Bayesian decision theory with cost functions and optimal Bayesian design theory from this Lindley. You arrive at the same point as a single objective function that has this sort of pragmatic and epistemic two sides of the same coin. That's been the focus of these 5 to 10 years. I think your focus and the focus of a lot of my younger colleagues now are exactly what happens when you put a lot of expected minimizing agents together. So there's been some provisional work in my world that I think will speak to your world work and the perspectives that you've been pursuing. Starting with very simple sort of spin glass models of lots of agents that are influencing each other and looking at the joint free energy solution. I think more interestingly, I don't know if you've come across the work of Michael Levin at Tufts University. He's looking to the kind of issues that you've spent decades working on, as evinced in his xenobots and his sort of cellular biology, both theoretical and in his empirical work. So he himself is not a biomathematician. He's got a number of friends who are now wondering if one could apply the free energy principle, not just to understand cell function in the autopoiesis of a single cell, but cell interactions and organ formulations and motility, self-organization, and the failures, such as in cancer, which is something that you've looked at. I think this is a ripe and open field. I'll finally just make 2 comments. György was talking about synchronization. The joint free energy minimizing solution on coupled agents is generalized synchrony. So mathematically, what it would look like if everybody was sharing their beliefs and talking and exchanging in the right kind of way, minimizing their supplies or their free energy together, then that would look like generalized synchrony or synchronization of chaos in a dynamical system. The final point is that I think your focus on logic
Excuse me, can I just Gordana, can you turn off your mic because it's causing a feedback loop?
Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to make the final comment. I think the point of contact with Dr. Werner's work is taking to the limit the uncertainty and thereby converting the belief propagation into effectively abductive inference that's very, very precise. And I think you can sort of formulate things in terms of logical operators. So there's some very provisional work framed in terms of inductive inference, which says what would happen if I've been around in my world or this room for long enough that I have very precise beliefs about the, if this then that. How would I write that into a belief update scheme that could be plausibly implemented in the brain? And I think at that point you may find a very close connection between the more sort of formal logical approaches you'd find in quantum.
Excuse me. Last week I came up with a method of actually taking your thing, and in the limit you can get the free energy principle in a logical kind of form. So it's interesting. Yeah. I think that's quite interesting.
Brilliant.
Pedro, are you speaking?
Yeah, no, I was saying that it is your turn. Afterwards, I will take my turn because otherwise I will get away. This is not very just for the moderator. Okay.
Thank you, Pedro. I just want to connect to mentioning Mike Levin, and I have a question. When you talk about cognition as ability to run this simulation internally about the world, then it means you should be a quite complex organism. And many cognitives or biologists especially, and especially Mike Levin, they talk about basal cognition. That would be cognition of every single cell. So how do you look at those sorts of approaches?
You really want to take that, or do you want me to wax lyrical about basal cognition?
I would like to ask György first.
Okay, let me start and then Karl can complement it. So I have more than a page description in two of my books about what is intelligent behavior and not cognition, and yet, but at least intelligent behavior. And the claim I made is that you can have 2 billion human neurons in a dish and it's totally useless, whereas you can have only a dozens of them in a dish, and then you can generate an output and connect it to a actuator that will have a feedback, and so we've got a closed loop, and we can pretend that's a body. And once you have a body, then it's an organism, and then it's intelligent. So a tiny little mosquito is much more intelligent than a petri dish full with human neurons. So that's conclusion one. Interestingly, Steve Porter, who was in my lab for a while at Georgia Tech, he was working on this, and recently Karl Friston and his colleagues actually did the same exact experiment, and they came up with a horrific title. It says sentient. And I think this is the interesting thing. As I mentioned in my intro, what I like most about, not most, but what I also like about Karl's work is that he is trying to substitute many of those words that humankind came up with and tried to explain, and we'll have no explanation because in every culture, in every discipline, we explain them differently. Instead, he talks about strange words that are very foreign to neuroscience, but nevertheless, they are precisely defined. So, when he talks about sentience, then he's right. In his world, a photodiode is sentient. In some people, like Giulio Tononi would say a diode or an LED has consciousness. So now we are back to Levin, you know, that what we have been doing over the past 100 years is we take the human mind and try to explain everything according to the human mind. And they said, oh, compared to that, the mosquito's brain is useless. But if you look at the other way, you know, what are the fundamental principles? Then I side with Karl, saying that, yes, maybe it's not sentient in a way how we are using it in the human communication world, but in fact, it satisfies the seeds of those things. So it's not a good answer, I know, and neither Carlo or I or anybody, I think, in our field wants to say that we are not better than rodents, where, you know, this is what we work with. But many of these things are easier to understand because they come in a more beautiful form in a simple organism than when there are so many other loops. But
yeah, I was thinking about if you cannot start with the living cell as a system which has this communication with the world, the feedback loop, everything, and then acknowledge that this is actually some very tiny cognition.
Well, the lesson we learned from genetics is that we learned more about human genetics by studying the American maze than studying human genetics. So the evolutionary thinking is always useful. Yeah. So, you know, we started from outside in, and we were thinking about explaining the spirits and going that way. And we usually stop with monkeys and so on. But another way is to start to build it up. And I think Karl's world is doing this in the mathematical sense. That's what is possible, how these things are linked to other things, and how this linkage can be redescribed in a new equation, which is understandable to everybody. And this is where neuroscience is not yet. I think Karl is the only person who is thinking of big, and this big. I'm not saying that others are not extraordinarily good, but at least he said, I offer you a new framework. And this is what I try to do, is I offer you a new framework from my primitive way.
Oh, thank you so much. Please, Karl, I know your work.
No, please.
Sorry.
No.
Sorry, but I know the answer Karl would give from his work.
Maybe you can have a second round at the end after the last the last question. I was willing to refer to an important absence from my point of view. It is what we may call topographic, because I think there are in the order of 200 topographic mappings, the brain at least. And then the sort of combined, let's say, topographical calculus that can be arranged, can be a source to explore, to facilitate the minimization of ratios of excitation inhibition, because finally this is what situates most of the processes of the organism with respect to the external environment, the retinal mapping, the auditory mapping, the gustative mapping, the olfactory mapping, etc. And then all these topographical interactions, I think they are the bread and butter of the overall information processing of the organism. And then another parallel question I have is the life cycle, the life course, what the microbiologists call the life history of the organism, of the microorganism in this case, has appeared very, very, very tinily. And then most of the functions of the nervous system are open-ended, and they need a connection with the processes necessary to organize a life cycle. I mean, in the human case, childhood, adolescence, maturity, seniority, etc. And then there is something very subtle that we are calling emotions, that they are in charge of recognizing matching patterns from the environment and inner stereotyped actions. This comes from the very beginning of the evolutionary process, but it has been getting more and more complex. So this is a plea to enter emotions into the general discourse of brain theory, because otherwise we live completely cast away a fundamental problem, a fundamental process that we are witnessing. It is the misuse of social and adaptive emotions. And it can be done for free because there is almost no theoretical enlightenment on them. There are many, many psychological theories, but there is no serious, I haven't seen serious neuroscience about that. So I would like to hear from Karl about the mapping and from George about the missing link with the life course or the life's history.
So topological, for example, retinotopic mapping is, I think, a wonderful smoking gun or piece of evidence that the causal structure of our world has to get installed into the anatomy of the machines that navigate that world. This is often described in terms of the early cybernetics movement, in terms of the good regulator theorem, that in order to actively engage and control my environment, I have to be a good model of that environment. And if the causal structure of this environment has some metric properties, for example, dominated by local action or classical physics or mechanics, then that should appear in my neuroanatomy. And the best example of that is something that you and I have actually written about, but I'll just keep to the spatial example of this. So this causal structure can be read statistically and in its simplest. If I lived in a universe in which that was constituted by objects according to some exclusion principle, then knowing what an object was doesn't tell me where it is. And knowing where an object is doesn't tell me what it is. So there's a fundamental statistical disconnect or independence there you should see in the brain in terms of a separation of the topographic mappings. And indeed, that's what we do see in terms of what and where streams in the brain. The other point I think that your example allows one to make is, why do we have sensory epithelia? I mean, why is it we have evolved to have sensors that are on sheets closely packed together? So I would imagine the olfactory system doesn't quite have that metric topology. So that's telling you something quite profound about the universe in which we live, that is now, if you like, embodied in our neuroanatomy through a process of Bayesian model selection or natural selection at a very long time scale, that tells you, that enables you to read the kind of world that this brain is trying to model and to install those invariances, those symmetries, or indeed that kind of beauty. So that I would use the topography argument to actually as evidence that it is the case that the evidence for the good regulator theorem, effectively, which is one version of this modern day active inference and inactive inference and active sensing. So I'll let you redo the life cycle, but I will just say that mathematically, biological self-organization has to have this conservative or solenoidal dynamics in it, which means you can't be a biological thing unless you have life cycles, and they can be gamma oscillations in dendrites right through to life cycles with metamorphosis. It's again this scale-free aspect that emerged, at the end of György's talk. In this instance, scale-free over time. So oscillations as we grow up are exactly the same kind of dynamic as oscillations in gamma theta coupling in the hippocampus, mathematically speaking. They're just maintaining your dynamics at different timescales.
Okay, Pedro, can I approach this from my angle? Namely that we haven't used the dirty word, consciousness, but the original meaning of the word, and in many other words, Russian, Hungarian, and the languages I know, that means shared knowledge. So I become aware because of you. You know, the social interactions are absolutely important, not only in humans, but in every other animal. We learn a lot through interactions. Now, the humans are very special species because the way how we learn knowledge, the semantic knowledge, is through experience. So you start with ego and you go to allo. So ego information is the episodic memory. I have seen a dog, and then see another dog, seeing a dog first time is an experience. When you see many of them, then you generalize. The brain always generalizes. And then you see a sheep, and you will say, or the child will say, oh, it's a dog, because you generalized. Okay? But that means that the way how you generalize, you strip off the spatio-temporal conditions that led to this abstracted thing, which is dogness, or the idea of the dog. Okay? Now, this is how every animal learns semantic information. Humans are special because humans have a funnel in their brains, big one here, and other people can pour in knowledge because we have language. So we learn a lot through language, and it immediately becomes semantic knowledge without going through your personal experience. So this is a mouse, you know, the mouse is not this, the gray mouse, but somebody told me this is called a mouse. I have no clue, honestly, what's inside there. I have some ideas, but I know the utility, and somebody told me what to do with it, and I follow it. And this applies to many, 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 many things, because we learn extraordinary amount of knowledge from other brains by this mechanism that we accept without our verification, without using our actions, what that means. Now, this is fantastic because you have enormous amount of knowledge that can come into you, but there is a danger. The danger is that because you didn't verify the meaning of those things, you can be easily misled. You accept the definition of authorities, and then you are in this culture that you mentioned, then your cultural background will determine how you think, how you act, and so on. So indeed, there is, you know, it's a well-known knowledge. I'm just reiterating it, but it has something very interesting that I'd like to share with you guys that I've been thinking about a lot, how it impacts science. So the frameworks that you are raised up, such as in the Amazon or in the Andes or somewhere else, has, or in you know, writing this way or writing this way or reading this way and reading that way, can have an extraordinary impact on your thinking. Now, when it comes to science, it doesn't matter whether you come from Indonesia, Sri Lanka, South America, you abandon your culture. You abandon the thinking of your culture and you become a European. Because thinking in neuroscience, or thinking in science in general, is based on cause-effect relationship, which is a European disease. To think that there is a cause and there is an effect in complex, you know, re-entry loops and so on. And you buy into a framework and abandon how different cultures would think about these things. So when I have somebody from India and said, I'd like to work on decision making, I say, ask your grandmother, you know, tell her what you are doing. And she has no clue what you are talking about, because there is no such a word or even a concept of decision making. So the interesting thing that you asked, Pedro, can be expanded to say, is there only one way to think about scientific solution? But people in Angkor Wat build extraordinary architectures. People in South America build extraordinary pyramids and elsewhere. and they didn't buy into, they didn't even know about European thinking. So what is the loss of science abandoning these cultural frameworks? I don't have the answer, but since you asked, I thought I will raise this issue.
Okay. Any other question around? Very brief one. Okay. Otherwise, we have been extremely on time, extremely punctual, and we must thank Karl and György. Professor Gornis, do you want to have the last word? Okay. Professor Gorni?
Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. If I have understood it correctly, there's a very good description of the effect of the brain on the process information in the mind. What I would like to know is how the effect of the meaningful information in the mind on the brain is described in both models.
I think we should postpone this to the next discussion. Because it's complicated.
Not bad idea. Okay, it is very, very deep question. We will keep thinking about that. And it is time to thank to all of you, to our speakers, and to have another meeting.
Thank you.
We can organize. Thank you. Okay, we can safely disconnect.
Thank you, Karl. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks.